Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 10 coverage of the U.S. Chess Championships in St. Louis, Missouri. This is the round before the last round, so just one more round to go after this one, and things are getting pretty tense at the top. There's still a number of players on both sides that are in contention for the championship. And one of those is Hikaru Nakamura, who's coming from behind, making a late play for the title. And we're going to take a look at his game against Jeffery Xiong today. Jeffery Xiong is one of the young players in the tournament, and he's had a remarkable score so far, not losing a single game, and also with one win. So great performance from a young player, and let's see how this game unfolds. Nakamura starts off with d4. Xiong plays knight to c6. c4 and g6, and this indicates either the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, and perhaps Jeffery is a Grunfeld player because Hikaru plays the move f3, which is known as kind of an anti-Grunfeld. And if Black continues with the Grunfeld plan here of playing d5, which is a move, actually it's one of the most popular moves here, so it's not like it's unplayable, but it's not as good a position as Black would get in a normal Grunfeld, because after e4, this knight doesn't have a knight on c3 to exchange itself against, and it has to retreat. So it's a slightly better than normal Grunfeld from White's point of view. So there are other ways that Black players have been playing here. You can continue with bishop g7 and d6, for example, like this, d6, e4, bishop g7. And this has transposed, I think those two moves could be played in either order also. This is transposed into a Samish King's Indian, so another way to play it. But Jeffery plays the somewhat unusual move, knight to c6. So just developing his knights and provoking this pawn to come forward. It's sort of a provocative move here, and Hikaru goes along with this. He pushes, provoking the pawn to come forward. He pushes the pawn forward, and then hops into e5, and he plays e4. So Nakamura has built up this giant pawn wedge, and Black will go about undermining it, a typical hypermodern strategy. Jeffery starts with d6. And although this looks very impressive from White's point of view with all that space and the big pawn center, White has no development. And in fact, Black is okay in this position. There's nothing wrong with this position. Now Nakamura starts developing his pieces, knight to c3, bishop to g7, and bishop to e2. And we're actually out of the opening book at this point because this is a bit of a rare line to start with after knight to c6, but nothing awful has gone wrong here. It's just that White has tried different things at this point. For example, f4 and bishop to g5 have been played here. All reasonable moves. Nakamura is going to play with the f4 idea. He just develops this bishop to e2 first, which actually is a pretty good idea because it takes away it starts to take away, put some pressure at least on the g4 square. I can't say it takes away because actually Black has two knights and a bishop looking at that square. But anyway, bishop to e2 prior to playing f4. Maybe it's to discourage Black from hopping a knight into g4. Black castles here. Nakamura pushes on with f4, and then this knight goes back to d7. Now the other bishop develops, bishop to e3. And e6, starting to undermine the pawn center. So everything is proceeding according to plan, I suppose you could say, by both players. Once again, its position looks very impressive for White. But, Black has a very solid position here and a resilient one. It's pretty flexible. And White has to play precisely to keep the advantage. And the next move from Nakamura is a good example of this precise play. He plays the move knight to h3, maybe not the first move you would think of. The kind of natural developing move knight f3, however, runs into knight to g4, and Black gains a tempo. White needs to do something about that bishop, and it's just a little bit awkward. So knight h3 is one of the key moves here. Keeps the knight out of the way of that bishop, so the bishop is maintaining control The queen and bishop are maintaining control on this diagonal, and the knight is still useful here. The knight is looking at the g5 square, and it's also looking at the pawn on f4. So good move from Hikaru there, keeping a slight edge for white. Queen to e7 was played, white castles, and b6. Bishop to f3. So just a little bit of rearrangement of the pieces, but Black did open up this diagonal, so it's pretty natural to put the bishop there. Black's idea is to develop the bishop on this diagonal. He needed to find a way. With the knights here, they're sort of clogging up the development of the light squared bishop, so he needed to find a way to develop that piece. But for the moment, he needs to get the rook out of the way. So rook to b8, queen to c2 now, and bishop to b7. So the bishop is supported here. If this diagonal opens up, then Jeffery can trade off the light squared bishops and should be fine. Rook a to e1 was played. Cancel that, e1. So bringing the rook all the way over to the king side, maybe with some future intent of pushing those pawns forward and opening up some lines towards the king. It looks like Hikaru's setting up for a king side attack, and Jeffery steps to the side with the king, with king to h8. The chess engine here, and also at a couple other points, wants to play the move a5, and a little bit of a mysterious move. I don't think, well, one idea may be to start some queenside counterplay, but I think the main idea is just to get one of those pawns into a state where it's protected, because in this position you'll see that both the a7 pawn and the c7 pawns are loose. And after king to h8, Nakamura seizes on this chance and plays knight to g5. Oh, I'm sorry, knight g5, knight to b5 is coming up. He plays knight g5 here. So just advancing on the king side first. This bishop goes to h6, and now he plays knight to b5. And what's funny is the chess engine wants white to expand on the king side, so it wants black to play on the queen side and white to play on the king side. So it's recommending this move h4 from white just to cement this knight here, and if it gets traded off, there's a very solid, well-supported pawn there on the g5 square. Okay, but Nakamura plays with knight to b5, and Jeffery goes for the trade, getting rid of that annoying knight on g5. Here, maybe that's not the best move. The engine is recommending e5 here, trying to counterpunch in the center, and also undermining this knight here, and giving up a pawn. Notice when this pawn came to g5, when this knight came to g5, it was hitting both pawns. Let's see, knight takes c7 is the better pawn to take. E takes f4, undermining that knight, but now bishop takes f4, defending the knight. And then this knight hopping into e5. Queen takes a look at this knight. This knight runs to e6. That's a funny idea. But after this trade, the knight has a good square on g5. And, well, this is the position that the chess engine prefers over the game continuation. It thinks white is better. White is up a pawn here, and white has the bishop pair, but it thinks that black should be able to hold this position. So that strike in the center now, in this position with e5, seems like the best play for black. After bishop takes g5, black is in serious trouble. The pawn takes back, and this knight has no great squares to go for. If it goes to h5, it'll just get traded off. So it drops all the way back to e8. Not a good sign. Well, sometimes this is part of some maneuver. Maybe the knight can reroute, but here it doesn't look like it has a big future there on g7. And Nakamura snags a pawn. Now, of course, this is one of those pawns where you can get the pawn back by playing rook a8 and grabbing the unprotected pawn on a2, which happens later in the game, but we'll see that there's a drawback to it in this case. But it's not quite a pure pawn at this place, at this point. So Jeffery embarks on a plan here to provoke some exchanges on the queen side and then grabs the pawn. It seems like that gets him into trouble again, or it gets him into worse trouble. The engine wants to play, just give up on that pawn and play the move c6. And that's kind of interesting. The pawn on c6 keeps this knight out of play. And the b6 pawn at the moment is protected by the knight. So queen b3, trying to go after that pawn perhaps, in advance of the rook coming over here to threaten the knight. And now if the rook threatens the knight here, rook a8, there's bishop takes d6. And you get another pawn and you're able to hold on to that knight. Although it looks like a bit of an awkward position for white, so maybe there's some compensation for black there. Well, the chess engine recommends knight to g7 here, ignoring the situation for the moment. And now it's not actually safe to take that pawn, because this bishop will just drop out of the way, and white's bishop on b6 would get pinned by the rook, and that would turn out to be okay for black. So h4, just defending the pawn over here on the king side, and then bishop to a8. And the chess engine wants to play this position for black and try and hold it. But white is in good shape here, maybe even winning. So already things are difficult for black. Anyway, he tried knight e5. His idea is to provoke some exchanges. This bishop drops back, trades off the rook on f1. So he didn't want a sudden. He didn't want the f-file opening up suddenly and a rook threatening to come to f8 with that check at an inopportune moment. So he just solves that problem by trading off on the f-file, and then he plays rook to a8, hitting the knight. He probably realized that he was going to get into a little bit of trouble here, but he wanted to get the material back at least, and then just play the position and see if he could hold it. Nakamura moves the knight out of the way. He grabs the pawn, and then the knight drops back to a3. And this is the problem, that the knight here is effectively out of play, and it's held in place by a knight. So in a sense, white is up the exchange. Now Jeffery had an idea here. There is an escape square for the rook. If he can get some pressure on that g7 pawn, maybe he can get out that way. So in a way, the queen is also tied down, keeping that rook tied up. Let's see, queen to g7 though, starting to look at this diagonal. And now bishop to d2. Of course, Hikaru has spotted this idea on the diagonal, and he has an idea to reposition his bishop. Excellent plan here from Nakamura. So this knight drops back to c6, opening up this diagonal with the threat to b2, but bishop to c3 solves that problem. And now knight to d4. You might wonder about this move, but if you try something like e5, shutting out that diagonal with the pawn seemingly more securely, the square on b3 is available for the queen, and this just wins the exchange. The rook has nowhere to go now. So knight to d4, a little bit precarious, but still holding on to things, keeping the queen out of that square. And the very funny move, bishop to d3 was played. So a tactical solution. But, well, if the knight grabs the queen, the bishop grabs this queen with check, and then there's time to take the knight. Here, let me turn on the chess engine for a little bit to look at this continuation, just to make sure there's nothing else going on. It's a complicated position. So yeah, if black plays knight takes queen, then rook to f1 is rook to f8 is mate. That's what I was missing. Yeah, I thought there was something there. So that's not playable. Let's erase those arrows. So some very nice tactics from Nakamura. So he's not worried about losing his queen there because of the mate threat. Pretty amazing. So the king goes to g8, which covers against that mate threat. And now the queen runs away to f2. So just keeping pressure on the open f-file here. But there's no longer a pin, so that's not a mate threat at the moment. And c5 is played to defend the knight. But at this point, there's no more saving the rook. The bishop drops back to b1, and the rook goes to a1. Well, the bishop harassing the rook has given it one escape square. But now there's a nice tactical move from Nakamura. If you want to guess the move here, well, I'm hovering my cursor over the piece that's important here, so it's probably a giveaway. So yeah, I'm going to give the answer away now. Nakamura played knight to c2. It's a fork. He's hitting the knight, and he's hitting the rook, and this knight is still pinned against the queen. Has no great moves that it can play with check. So I mean, it does have a move it can play with check, but it just gets taken there. So there's no great escape moves for the knight there. So this just loses the exchange. Rook takes b1, rook takes b1, and now bishop takes e4 was played, and that gets at least a pawn for the exchange. And so Jeffrey was maybe thinking he can still survive this. You know, a pawn for the exchange is sometimes enough compensation, but that runs into big trouble. So let's look at another alternative here. It seems like best play here is e5, just clogging up that center. And then rook to e1, defending the e-pawn. Oh, e5, clogging up the center. Rook to e1, defending the e-pawn, which is still under pressure from the bishop. Queen over to e7, h4, that was attacking the pawn and defending the pawn. King up to g7, and b4, just trying to disrupt this pawn structure here. White is up the exchange, and yeah, it's just a pure exchange. The pawns are even, and it looks like white should be okay in this position. I mean, okay as in winning, but it would be a longer, slower process than in the game. So rather than go down just by being down material, Jeffrey grabs this pawn here, and now there's a really great move from Nakamura once again. Let's see, is this the place where it's good to give a quiz? Yeah, there's right here. So you're white, it's your turn to move. See if you can find the best move here. And yeah, this required some deep calculation, so see if you can you pause the video if you want some time to think about it, but it's a very nice tactical puzzle. Okay, I am going to give the answer away now. He played knight takes d4, sacrificing the rook. Just giving up that whole rook. And all he's got to show for it are a bishop and a knight and a queen that seem well poised. Maybe I put it that way. But there's a very specific continuation here. And after bishop takes b1, why don't you see if you can find the continuation in this spot? What is the idea that Nakamura has in mind here? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now, so pause the video if you want some time to think about it. The killer move here is knight to f5, just placing that knight there where it can be taken. But, well, there's a couple of problems here in black's position now. First of all, the queen is under attack from two pieces. So you can't just take the knight, you would lose the queen. And if you move the queen, this is the real tactical point. Say queen runs away, say to d7 here, queen to d7, just to get away from any threats from the knight. The knight has a bigger threat, and that threat is knight to h6, which is checkmate. The bishop is guarding all of those squares, the queen is guarding the escape squares, and the knight delivers the mate. A very pretty mating pattern with bishop and knight, and one that arises often in these fianchetto situations, so something to keep an eye on. If your opponent has lost his dark squared bishop here, and he's got a fianchetto, this mating pattern is often very useful. Sometimes you don't even need control of the f-file, right? For example, if there was a rook on the f8 square, the king would still be trapped in that box. So nice little pattern there. Something everyone should know. So anyway, Jeffrey does take the knight. There's basically nothing better to do. E takes f5, gives up the queen. King takes. Nakamura plays queen to e3, and then Jeffrey resigns here. There's not going to be any way to set up a fortress. Sometimes you can organize your pieces and set up a fortress against a queen, but there's lots of pawns on the board for one thing, and the queen is just going to come in and gobble up those pawns after the knight moves, and there's just no stopping it. So Yep, Jeffrey resigned at this point. So nice win for Hikaru. Very fine game. And well, too bad for Jeff, but he's having a great tournament. He's got an even score against a bunch of very strong grandmasters. So good for him as well. Let's take a look at the standings. So Fabiano Caruana is still in the lead at 7.5 points. But I think both Caruana and So only managed to draw. And so Hikaru has gained ground on him. So both Wesley So and Hikaru Nakamura are half point behind the leader, Fabiano Caruana, with only one round to go. So they are still all three in contention. And technically, so is Ray Robson. He's only 1 point behind. So there's some sort of mathematical possibility that, if Fabiano loses, Ray wins, and Wesley and Hikaru draw, then he could get a share of first place as well. Although that might not be possible. It depends on the pairings tomorrow. So we'll just have to wait and see. But there's at least 3 and maybe 4 players still in contention for the top prize going into the final round. And there's some tie breaks planned if they all end up being tied. And then let's go over to the women's side. There was some interesting developments over there. There were 5 decisive games again on the women's side, so a lot of blood being spilled. And the 2 pre-tournament favorites, Irina Krush and Anna Zatonsky, both lost their games, losing to Carissa Yip and Jennifer Yu, 2 of the younger players in the tournament. So the juniors are taking their revenge on their elders. No respect at all. So they're out of contention. They've been eliminated by those losses, and there's only 2 players in contention, Tatev Abrahamyan at 8 points and Nazi Paikidze at 7.5 points. They both won their games, so they're keeping up a tremendous pace. And going into the final round, the winner will be one of those 2. So that's where things stand. Stay tuned. I'll be bringing you coverage of the final round shortly. See you then. Bye.